the semester. Anybody out there with, like, if you have an interest in politics or history or current events, I'd consider taking a class in Middle East studies, maybe even pick up a minor. It's always a good time to be informed, and there's certainly no better time to be informed about the Middle East than right now. Now, as for the primary text program, that's a certificate program here on campus. Some of you may already be enrolled. And our objective is to encourage direct engagement with primary texts as opposed to, say, like textbooks. So we're very interested in direct learning through primary text inquiry. We support a wide range of scholarly activities here on campus. We publish a Live Ideas undergraduate journal, for instance, that provides a forum for undergraduate research and creative activity. We sponsor an art contest. We direct undergraduate research institutes, and every year we've got over $10,000 in scholarships that we give to our students in the program. So if you're a student and you're interested in learning more about program requirements, they're really quite minimal. We've got brochures right over here by the door. I think there's some Middle East studies materials as well. So anybody who's interested in either program, please, grab something on your way out. Okay. On to the main event. I'm very pleased to welcome Murad Idris to campus today. Professor Idris is an associate professor of political theory at University of Michigan. He's got a outstanding record of research in his field, or our field, I guess. His book, War for Peace, Genealogies of a Violent Ideal in Western and Islamic Thought, won the David Easton Award from the American Political Science Association. That's very prestigious within the discipline. It won some other awards from ISA, International Studies Association, as well. He co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Political Theory. That's a very important resource in the field, in our field. And in addition to these books, he's published a lot of articles on a wide range of topics in many of the discipline's very best journals. Today's talk is about a thinker, Ibn Tufayl. He's a medieval Islamic philosopher, and a text called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, about which I know precious little. I know precious little about the thinker or the text. So I'm extremely grateful to Professor Idris for coming to campus today to teach me and to teach us. So that said, please join me in welcoming Murad Idris to Manhattan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be here. Thanks for being here. I'm really honored to be delivering this lecture and to do that with all of you. My presentation focuses on the 12th century Islamic philosopher Ibn Tufayl as a window into thinking about the relationship between politics and ethics, and about the global intellectual history of philosophy. Today, I'll discuss some of the thorny problems surrounding how to interpret the place of ethics and politics in this text, as well as key episodes in its reception history and how Ibn Tufayl was read around the world. So the aim is to do both things, right? To think about the text and about its reception history. But first, let me say a few words about Ibn Tufayl. Ibn Tufayl was born in 1105 in Muslim Spain, and he died in Marrakesh in North Africa. He's part of what today is called Andalusian philosophy. And Ibn Tufayl was part of a so-called golden age, though he wasn't really read quite as much as some of his contemporaries during his own lifetime. We only have one complete text by him, and that's Hayy ibn Yaqzan. Hayy ibn Yaqzan is a philosophical allegory. The literal translation of the title is something like living son of awakened. That's also the name of the protagonist. Let me offer a brief overview of the story. And it's a really odd story. Oftentimes, descriptions of the story make it seem really more direct, really more simple. as though it's immediately about epistemology or theology. But again, it's a weird story, and I am committed to preserving weirdness. The text. So this image and some of the others that I'm going to show you, they're from a children's picture book from the 1980s, where the story was adapted for little kids like mine, like John's. The text begins with a survey of philosophical opinions about revelation and God, and then Ibn Tufayl gives us an allegory about the main character, Hayy ibn Yaqzan, as well as two other characters named Absal and Salaman. Ibn Tufayl says that some people say that Hayy ibn Yaqzan was spontaneously generated on an island. And then he says, other people say he was left in an ark by his mother and then eventually drifted there. This is likely a dramatization of how philosophy and religion, reason and scripture use different means to bring us to roughly the same place. And here the text is presenting the two openings as equally plausible. Maybe it's a kind of choose your own adventure. In either case, the infant, Hayy, ends up on an uninhabited island. A doe finds him and raises him. Some of the other animals are kind of mean, they bully him, so he learns to use sticks to keep them away. Some 8 years later, the doe dies. So Hayy dissects her in order to save her. So while poking around her heart, Hayy realizes that her soul has departed. Most readers see this as a clear moment where natural experience and experimentation allow Hayy to discover the existence of the soul. Interestingly, its existence here is only confirmed by its absence. Readers rarely ponder what it means that Hayy, right at this moment, trying to save his mother figure, cuts her open. It sounds really awful. One scholar has described its significance for thinking about gender in the text, and I tend to think that perhaps it indicates his trauma, right? His mother dying and then cutting her open, that perhaps this is what led him to discover or invent the idea of the soul. It's a kind of comforting thought. He determines that there's a God, and eventually he becomes able to behold him through rituals involving compassion, cleanliness, and contemplation. And initially he thinks that just as God is compassionate, so he also has to show compassion to animals. And so he helps them whenever they're trapped. He also helps plants if it looks like they're growing in ways that obstruct each other. Later, he understands that he was mistaken, and that he really should only be focusing on contemplation and on abandoning the trappings of this material world. So he worships God, contemplating him, and by the time that he's 50, he understands everything about existence. The story could have just ended there, but it doesn't. So, meanwhile, on a nearby island, there's a community of believers. Their leader is named Salaman, and he and the islanders believe in community. Here's from the text. Salaman preferred being among people and gave greater weight to the sayings of the law in favor of society, since he was by nature wary of too much independent thinking or doing. In staying with the group, he saw some means of fending off demonic promptings, dispelling distracting thoughts, and in general guarding against the goadings of the devil. The other main person on the second island is an esotericist named Absal. Absal does not share Salaman's beliefs. He thinks that the truth of texts is something that you need to read between the lines, behind the lines. So he leaves in search of seclusion. And as it so happens, he is shipwrecked on Hay's island. So they meet. Absal teaches Hay language, and Hayy imparts philosophical wisdom to Absal. They find that Absal's religion is a lesser image of the truth that Hayy had discovered. And so the two visit Absal's island to educate its inhabitants. The people flock to Hayy, but he thinks that they misuse the tools of logic. He incessantly preaches at them, and their initial awe towards Hayy turns into bitterness. But, they try to stay polite because Hayy is their guest and he's friends with their friend, Absal. Ibn Tufayl writes the following: the moment he, Hayy, rose the slightest bit above the literal or began to portray things against which they were prejudiced, they recoiled in horror from his ideas and closed their minds. Out of courtesy to the stranger and in deference to their friend Absal, they made a show of being pleased with Hayy, but in their hearts they resented him. Hayy found them delightful and continued his exposition of the truth. Exoteric, meaning superficial, and esoteric, meaning behind the surface, night and day. But the more he taught, the more repugnance they felt, despite the fact that these were men who loved the good and sincerely yearned for the truth. When Hayy realizes this about the islanders, he becomes convinced that most people are at the level of irrational animals. The text tells us that their failure is simply due to their inferiority by nature, and that they have these mistaken positions on matters of theology. The text concludes with a theological scriptural reference: theirs will be an awesome punishment. You can't teach them, you can't save them, and that's why they have religious laws to govern them. He was wrong to try to help them. So he tells the islanders, you all were right. Forget anything that I said. You keep doing what you were doing. And so he returns with Absal to their island. The two worship together, and eventually they die. The end. It is an odd story. Most readers see Hayy ibn Yaqzan as the protagonist. But I want to ask a different question here. How should we read Hayy's politics? How should we read his ethics? First and most obviously, this is a text about how epistemic hierarchy, or the ordering of people based on what they know and their capacity to know, it doesn't correspond to rule. So not only do the best people not rule, but they also can't rule. And the ordinary mass of people, like us, are beyond help. So in that way, it's against the conventional reading of famous philosophical texts like the Republic, in which those who know best and think best are those who should govern and rule. Because here, epistemic hierarchy is at odds not just with rule, but with community. You cannot be a virtuous person and a virtuous citizen. Maybe it's partly because the virtues are different, but it's also fundamentally because community, being with others, it turns out, is a problem. And that's the second point. There's a real disdain in this text for the masses, for ordinary people. The best that they can do is a lesser image of the truth. And even then, we're told they're going to face this punishment in the hereafter. Now, maybe we should consider the source. A philosopher thinks philosophers are naturally superior to everyone else. The elitism of philosophers is, of course, not so special. But what if readers are wrong to see Hayy, who is undoubtedly gifted and quite odd, as a success? What if Hayy ibn Yaqzan, with all of his weirdness and his strangeness and his pretty odd experiences, is actually something of a failure? After all, we saw him realize that he had made mistakes, like when he thought that compassion towards animals and plants was wrong. And we also saw him do some rather bizarre things, like dissect his mother, or go around wearing the carcasses of animals, which terrifies all the poor creatures on the island. On the other hand, maybe he's neither this kind of superhuman success story, nor an utter failure, but rather something else. Maybe Hayy is modeling a different ethic, one that, even if it's with contempt and disdain, learns to walk away, to leave, to let people be. He lies to the islanders and then he leaves. He didn't fear for his life when he was with the islanders, even though a number of Orientalist commentators in the subsequent centuries would say that he did. He doesn't tell them that they're all wrong, they're all doomed to failure, and then kind of leave in a big huff. Nor does he simply walk away without saying anything, whether in broad daylight or at night. Instead, he goes to the islanders, having realized they will never comprehend the truths that he has and that their religion is really the best that they can do, and he lies to them by saying he realized that he was wrong. He doesn't think that he was wrong, and he leaves. One possibility that I want to try to preserve here is that he is enacting an ethic, a different ethic, one that cares precisely by refusing to invest in further care, just passing by, renouncing mastery, ceding space, disavowing the proselytizing zeal of engagement and persuasion, just walking away. And again, I do want to insist that there is something like an ethic in this, one that most of us are familiar with, one that most of us have practiced, even if we don't always recognize it and even if we don't always name it. Finally, I want us to go back to consider the source. I said a philosopher writes a text that says philosophers are the best people ever. And we tend to focus on Hayy as if no one else in the story exists. But what about the islanders? Why do the islanders stay with Hayy, and why do they behave as they do? What if the islanders, not just Hayy, are also ethical beings? You know, their own principles are recorded in the text itself, right? They have this commitment to hospitality, this real belief in friendship, and this belief that community is important. Right? It's hospitality toward the foreigner, friendship to the friend of the friend, and community with everyone. And they really seem to practice an absolute form of each of these: hospitality toward any foreigner, no matter what he says; a contagious form of friendship, where the friend of the friend is a friend; and universal community that requires togetherness and denigrates seclusion or separation. If we put ourselves in the islanders' shoes, the problem seems to be that each of these three principles ends up undercutting itself. And is that not also how so many of our own ethical principles and moral imperatives operate? Isn't that part of the tragic sense of political life, where the more we try to follow our ethical principles, the more these principles can turn out to come into conflict with each other, or for our attempts to follow these principles to undercut what we were trying to do? So the text here would be about the relationship of principles to action, or ethics to politics, the self-subversion and the limits of our ideals. And also it would be about who gets to act, who gets to speak, right? The text continually focuses on Hayy as though he's the only person who exists. This is a generative and I think, again, quite odd text. And we can reflect on how the text presents epistemic hierarchy, the masses of people, the two competing codes of ethical conduct, Hayy and then the islanders, ones that seem to roughly map onto philosophy and community, the virtuous man and the virtuous citizen, the elite or superhuman and the ordinary. So an odd text indeed. But to many people, it sounds familiar. Some people say that Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe was based on it. Others say that Kipling's Jungle Book was based on it. And most remarkably, quite a few scholars over the last 25 or so years have said that John Locke's theories of human understanding, reason, the individual experience, and maybe even toleration are based on it. So with Locke, the story goes something like this. The Orientalist, Edward Pocock Sr., was a professor at the University of Oxford. He and his son, Edward Pocock Jr., often went on, you can call them manuscript plundering missions in the Middle East. And they got their hands on an Arabic manuscript with this allegory and translated it into Latin. Pocock and Locke knew each other. Even though Pocock translated it after Locke wrote his texts, maybe he told him about it, or maybe he showed him a draft of his translation. So that's the theory that some people present about the historical significance of Hayy ibn Yaqzan. When Ibn Tufayl is presented as a proto-Lockean or as Locke's inspiration, this is usually for ideas about man as a blank slate or the development of rationality through individual experience. And for those of you who have read John Locke, not, for example, Locke on property. Right? Scholars don't point out that Hayy does not try to take the native islanders' land away on account of his supposed intellectual superiority or his greater inventiveness with tools or land. Nonetheless, it is interesting that this 12th century allegory traveled to Europe. And it's also interesting that we say it traveled to Europe because Spain was always in Europe. It just happened to be Muslim. And here you see 3 English frontispieces from 1708, 1731, and 1929. So the text was translated numerous times, and for many interpreters, it was somewhere between a Rorschach blot and a mirror. So Quakers believed that it was about the inner light. Empiricists emphasized Hayy's experimentation. Rationalists thought it was about the supremacy of reason. And Orientalists thought it was about the limitations of ordinary Muslims for cultural reasons. It became enshrined as a classic in the colonial and post-colonial Middle East only after this period, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Arab intellectuals often said that this text was important because it had traveled to Europe. We could use the history of this text as a lens for the formation of a body of thought that would come to be called Islamic philosophy in the Middle East and in Europe. And we can use it as a lens for thinking about the travel of this body of thought across regions, to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and also across all the different languages that it's been translated into. We can look at the different editions, the prefaces, the marginalia, the commentaries, including how the story could be used in children's books, right? As part of an attempt to produce the nation, to imagine different geographies and different grand narratives about how we got to where we are. And today, it's a standard text in what's increasingly called the global humanities. And so the text's history can also help us rethink the politics of that curriculum and the politics of primary texts. Many scholars today claim that Muslim thinkers are important because they anticipated or influenced modern European thought. And I think they do this by downplaying just how truly odd this text is. The trope has an important but neglected precedent, one that again downplays the oddness of the story. So now we're going to travel in time a little bit. Between 1882 and 1947, Arab scholars attached significance to classical Arabic texts and to their European translations as precursors to modern European thought. So for these writers, Ibn Tufayl became the Muslim herald of European modernity, without whom European modernity would not have been possible. I want to put that claim to the side and ask this other question. Why did these scholars identify with a 12th century text of philosophy? And why did they keep repeating the claim that it influenced European development? What work did that claim do? Modern Arab scholars of the classics, who we might call the technicians of tradition, they invited readers to retrospectively identify with Hayy ibn Yaqzan, to displace cultural pride and anxiety onto the text's history and its reception in Europe. What is facilitated by making this book about modern Europe? What's facilitated by making it about an Islamic philosophical heritage and about how the colonized engendered or anticipated their colonizers' modernity? What projects, what global imaginaries were served in these presentations of the text's historical significance? Ibn Tufayl became a figure through whom the colonized could claim a kind of ownership or superiority over their colonizers. Editors of the text in their prefaces and in their articles and in their books, they directed readers to find value in the text as Europe's predecessor, as prefiguring trends in modern European thought, or as having enabled them, if not outright caused them. Ibn Tufayl became a kind of ancestral avatar. European thinkers became inferior or derivative. And all these comparisons of Ibn Tufayl to European thinkers, they facilitated two fantasies: a fantasy of cultural superiority and a fantasy of historical genesis. And so this reinscribed the political dominance of the colonizer because it maintained a teleology, a particular linear historical progression in which the endpoint was European intellectual development. But these editors also imagine a different configuration of global and Arab power. They imagine alternative futures, anti-imperial geographies, and so their claims about Ibn Tufayl's importance for falsafa or philosophy, they are pegged on the one hand to their increasing insistence that he is superior, that he is the precedent, or that he generated Europe. And it's also pegged, on the other hand, to the alternative worlds that they try to imagine beyond Europe. So what I want to do in the remainder of my time is sketch out this overall argument in 3 episodes, and then I want to come back to the story itself. One of the first popular surveys of Islamic philosophy was published in 1927 by Muhammad Lutfi Jum'ah. Jum'ah was a fairly famous public intellectual, and he translated a lot of different primary texts, a lot of classics, including Plato's Symposium, Machiavelli's Prince, and a few South Asian and East Asian texts as well. His book, The History of Islam's Philosophers, it combines two impulses. First, it wants to create this awe-inspiring canon of Islamic thinkers, but it also on the value of these thinkers by reference to Europe, either in comparison to European thought or because of the claim of its influence on Europe. So, for example, he writes, "This fantasy story is a kind of rational beatitude that many European writers and thinkers imitated and in the footsteps of which they followed." While Jum'a does not say who these European thinkers are or how exactly they mimicked Ibn Tufayl, he turns to Robinson Crusoe to demonstrate Ibn Tufayl's originality. And so this book that Jum'a wrote, it is haunted by Europe from the start. Jum'a begins by addressing the dead Muslim philosophers, calling them forth into the present. He says, "Come forward, wise gentlemen." And he invites them out of what he calls the cave of the past and a world of silence and quiet to the present, in order to strike the Arab masses with the foreignness of their own past. He says, "The majority of the people of this age have not had the honor of knowing who you are. Some will pass by you, surprised at who these ancient philosophers are who lived, contemplated, and explained the universe, who diagnosed events before Kant, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Spencer, John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte, and Renan." These thinkers prefigure European philosophers, and he thinks made them possible. It will not occur to the minds of these surprised readers that were it not for you, dear philosophers, from Al-Kindi to Ibn Rushd, it would not have been possible for any modern European philosopher to appear in the world of existence. Quite the bold claim there. So here, the importance of a Muslim canon, Al-Kindi to Ibn Rushd, with Ibn Tufayl, somewhere in there, is in reference to Europe, to making Europe possible. And Islam's contribution is, of course, located squarely in the past. But Jum'a also thinks beyond this. He imaginatively opens up an alternate vision of an East-centric world history and intellectual production that brackets Europe. So he writes a kind of bond of solidarity and resonance between the Eastern Hemisphere's two corners, saying that the Islamic Renaissance during this period reverberated across the East, shaking the corners of the globe. He says, the Persians, Turks, Mongols, and Indians rose up, and even the people of China and of Japan engaged in reform. The Renaissance of Islam was like the tremors of an earthquake. And Jum'a concludes, the two Easts, near and far, were influenced by the Renaissance movements that appeared in either, each having an echo in the other. And now he implies an alternative future based on this other past of Islamic philosophy. And this is the last sentence of this quote. And what was true for the 9th century is also true for the Renaissance of the 19th century in the two Easts, near and far. So here we have a vision of two Easts that seems to carve out space for pan-Asian world histories and practices, where you have a quiet cultural resonance across the continent, with humanistic work in one corner, echoing, calling forth the Renaissance in the other. By imagining the East as an interconnected world and a frame already beyond Europe, Jum'a takes the geography of Orientalism's the Orient and turns it back against Europe. Islam's philosophers become a reservoir of a forgotten past, one that bypasses Europe, extends to the Far East, and calls forth new renaissances without and against European empire. He reimagines both cultural and political power outside of imperial power. So reading Ibn Tufayl was a way for the colonized to say, we created our colonizers, but it was also to say, it doesn't have to be this way. And can we imagine a cultural order of the world that looks different? Jum'ah's inter-Eastern comparisons and affiliations, they fall out of the other afterlives of Hayy ibn Yaqzan. So in 1931 and 1933, two articles on Ibn Tufayl emerged. The second one, by the way, was plagiarized from the first. Like there are just paragraphs copied and pasted, and no one caught it until I did. Anyway, the authors are no longer alive, so can't do anything. Anyway, one article affirms Ibn Tufayl's influence on European philosophy and fiction as the clearest indication of his importance, while the second presents Ibn Tufayl as more important because he accomplished everything that he did before what he calls European storytellers. The first article is by Ferdinand Tautal, and it's important for two reasons. It's all about anxieties about the superiority of European scholarship about the text. And second, it's important because Tautal critiques Ibn Tufayl for his elitism and his obscurantism. It is as though he says, Ibn Tufayl withholds, or you could say begrudges, the capacity for understanding spiritual life from the majority of readers. Notice here, the commentator, Tautal, he sides against Ibn Tufayl, against Hayy, with ordinary readers, and perhaps with the allegories ordinary islanders, where he's like, come on, man, they probably understand some stuff too. Why are you looking down on them? He refuses the text, in other words, because he rightly, I think, notices its anti-egalitarianism. But by the end, he drops his critical engagement to just reaffirm what European commentators say. He says, Ibn Tufayl is the best Arabic story ever, and it is the best summary of Arabic philosophy that we have. His plagiarist, 2 years later, he left out the critique. So he just praises Ibn Tufayl's story as accessible, as beautiful, and we're only left with this vision of the awe-inspiring or the monumental. And notice the conflict here. This commentator, Tautal, wants to say this is a great text. And we know this, he says, at least in part because it influenced Europe. But at the same time, he seems to say, this text, it is such a problem. It treats the majority of people as though they're inferior, and that's not okay. The sense that the allegory is not egalitarian, that it's elitist, and that it's not going to teach ordinary citizens the right lessons, it reaches its apex around 50 years later. So if you recall the children's version that I showed you right at the beginning, it changes the ending. In the actual story, Hayy ibn Yaqzan meets the islanders. He tries to teach them. He thinks that they don't get it. They get annoyed, but they don't say anything. He notices, I guess he's hurt, so he leaves and he decides, everyone's at the level of an irrational animal. I'm done. In the children's version, Hayy and Absal go to the island. The people listen to his story, and then they say, God is great. His power is marvelous. For the greatest gift he has given us is reason. The end. There's no conflict. And everyone gets to be just like Hayy. Which means changing the story and giving it a kind of interesting liberal lens, right? And this version of the story is now available in English as of 2002. And similar work has gone into revising other Arabic and Muslim texts. You could think of it as making philosophy safe for children, but also as reproducing a vision of humanity based on agreement, reason, harmony, persuasion, and without place for the 4 questions of politics that I said are at the center of thinking about its politics and its ethics, right? Epistemic hierarchy, disdain for the masses, an ethic of passing by, and how our own ideals and ethics undercut one another and how this is the basic friction and perhaps fundamental tragedy of politics. Tawtal ends his article by saying that he hopes what he's written might pave the way for an edition of the text in the Middle East, and his wish would come true 4 years later. The first scholarly Arabic edition of the text was published in 1935, and the first monograph in 1946. The two editors of the text are Jamil Saliba and Kamil Ayyad. Jamil Saliba was a Syrian scholar of Arabic historical and philosophical inquiry. He was trained in Paris, and he wrote extensively on Ibn Sina, education, the history of Arab thought and science, French thought, and he also produced a 2-volume Arabic, English, French, Latin dictionary. His writings reflect his concern with the Arab contribution to world civilization and its place in Arab self-understandings. His co-editor, Kamil Ayyad, wrote on the Muslim thinker Ibn Khaldun, the history of philosophy, the lives of Orientalists, Japan, and social and political issues. He was born in Libya. He emigrated during the 1911 Italian invasion. He then studied in Berlin and moved to Damascus. Omar Farrukh, who wrote the book on Ibn Tufayl, he came from a conservative Muslim family from a village outside Beirut. And he wrote on contemporary politics, histories of Arab thought, pre-Islamic literature, and Greek philosophy. And he also wrote a book about the relationship of missionaries to colonialism in 1953, I believe. Farrukh grew up in Beirut. He studied at the American University of Beirut, then in Germany, and he wrote this book while in Beirut, years before he moved to Damascus. And these scholars had a pretty intense disagreement about how to read Ibn Tufayl. There was some name calling, but behind it, there was a deeper disagreement about how we should think about power, the future, and primary texts. Here are pictures of Saliba, first as a young man, then as a seasoned scholar. In the 1935 edition, Saliba and Ayyad, they refuse the usual comparisons. So in their introduction, they saying that there's a relationship of borrowing or imitation of Robinson Crusoe from Hayy ibn Yaqzan is all nonsense. And so they say all these comparisons are just inappropriate because Ibn Tufayl is so superior to everything that came after that these comparisons are nonsense. There's no comparison, certainly not to something like Robinson Crusoe. Meanwhile, in the first monograph devoted to Ibn Tufayl, 11 years later, by Omar Farrukh, when Robinson Crusoe reappears in the final chapter, Defoe is only the 6th European writer whom Farrukh claims was influenced by Ibn Tufayl. So if Saliba and Ayyad, the ones who made that edition, use contrasts to demonstrate originality and superiority, Farrukh highlights similarity because he thinks it has to imply influence. So he lists Albertus Magnus, Aquinas, Spinoza, Rousseau, Descartes, Locke, and pretty much the whole canon of Western thought. On Robinson Crusoe, he says, Defoe had not passed away until the story of Hayy ibn Yaqzan was copied into Latin, English, Dutch, German, and had spread greatly. It's unthinkable that Defoe wrote a book that is similar to Hayy ibn Yaqzan to this degree without having known about it. So Farrukh also thinks that Ibn Tufayl made all of European thought and perhaps European modernity possible. Notice here how the colonized intellectual claims antecedence and power over the colonizers' intellectual production as their haunting past. Islamic philosophy, he says, controlled the European mind for a few hundred years without interruption. Ibn Tufayl alone guided European thought, which demonstrates Islamic philosophy's relevance for human thought. When we go back to Saliba and Ayyad, we see that they present Ibn Tufayl as unique and superior to all others. But they also approach the allegory as a theory of the natural development of the pure individual stripped of social influences. This is that famous idea that would come to be called a person as a blank slate. So Hayy becomes any man, every man, not a kind of weird prophet, philosopher, superhuman, spontaneously generated on an island raised by a doe that he dissects. The nearby island becomes a human association with traditions and inherited habits, a sociological experiment for the relationship of the individual to society. The editors erase Hayy's supernatural superiority, making the allegory safe and applicable to the ordinary. They erase his elite status and his abnormality. They say, it is unlikely that Ibn Tufayl intended from the first half of the story to say that a single isolated individual can attain what Hayy attained without the aid of a group. Indeed, his aim was to represent human development without needing divine revelation. With this normalization of Hayy, they also erase the people whom Ibn Tufayl actually constructs as normal, the islanders. So they turn the whole section about the islanders into Ibn Tufayl's veiled critique of corrupt regimes. As for the second half of the story, it's nothing but a means of concealed social critique. Ibn Tufayl wanted by this to dissect the social conditions of his age and to expose the corruption of regimes, the decay of morals, and the disappearance of religious principles. This is interesting because Ibn Tufayl does not say a word about regime corruption, moral decay, the withdrawal of religion. He consistently casts the islanders as pious, honest, in fact, as the best among ordinary people, ultimately limited by nature. But speaking of veiled critiques, maybe they're transposing the problem of the modern post-colonial society with its corrupt regimes onto this context. Maybe it's their own critique that's being veiled. The two things that these scholars found unthinkable and unlikely are, of course, both thinkable and likely. Ibn Tufayl was probably not the source of various European texts and modernity, as Farrukh would have it, and Hayy ibn Yaqzan is really not of practical use for the everyday person, as Saliba and Ayyad would have it. Ibn Tufayl did not produce European modernity, and Hayy is not the average person, and they said as much to each other. Farrukh mocks their analysis and also their typos of various European scholars' names, and he says they are stuck in a different century. They disagreed about which context matters. Right? Saliba and Ayyad had explained the allegory in terms of Ibn Tufayl's life. For them, Hayy was really Ibn Tufayl, and the leader of the island, Salaman, was really the caliph. So they confined the text to the author's context, to the life of the author. And here it's a happy context. Farrukh describes Ibn Tufayl's age as absolute anarchy. And for him, philosophy flourished in spite of this. So this kind of intellectual production, it helps combat social and political anarchy. And he says maybe it can do these things again in his age. The two editors and Farrukh, they read Ibn Tufayl's context as their own. And depending on how they read their present, they saw Ibn Tufayl differently. Depending on how they read Ibn Tufayl, that showed them different things about their present. Farrukh offers an unconventionally broad context for the text. So he starts his book by discussing North Africa and its origins. Then he discusses the Crusades, the papal struggles, the Norman conquest of Sicily, the situation of the Byzantine Empire, until he gets to the colonization of the Middle East. So he situates Ibn Tufayl in these world historical terms that shape the geopolitics of his present. And in a different text, he also challenges readers to understand history as a world historical battle between Europe and Asia, the West and the East, where the Middle East is a kind of battleground. Saliba hated this. Or maybe he didn't like that Farrukh had mocked the typos in his book. So he takes on the tones of scandalized disciplinary authority in a book review, which is really the worst thing that a scholar can do to another one. So he said, Farrukh makes unqualified proclamations and he fails to adhere to the basics of historical methods. Instead of focusing on the life of the author and the events that directly impacted his philosophy, the book is about irrelevant events and tangents with no relationship to him. Their disagreement wasn't just methodological. Saliba thought the problem was corrupt regimes and moral decay and the singularity of the Arab philosopher. He doesn't say a single word about European imperialism. Farrukh thought the text was all about European empire. And the different approaches really came down to the question of why one studies the past and its primary texts, whose past it is, and the relationship of these texts to the different futures that people could imagine. Now, I'd like to wrap up by raising 3 or 4 things. My first contention is that by looking at how a text was canonized, how people read it, we get a fuller picture into the inside of a discipline. We get a richer, moving image into how the editors, translators, and scholars understood the world. We get why this is a text that today is being read. And I focused on how it was read in the Middle East and how we should look at editors and translators as political thinkers in their own right, as ones producing primary sources. They're the ones who create traditions. They're the ones who invent all sorts of narratives about which texts matter and what they mean to us today. We might explore how the text was translated into other languages and how it's being canonized as Islamic philosophy all over the world. The second thing I want to mention is that this kind of afterlife of the text can help us think critically about the terms on which we read texts, to think about the history of these terms, where they come from, what they do, or their productivity, and the comparisons that appear natural or obvious. When we compare this text to Locke or to Robinson Crusoe or to whoever, are we doing this to generalize Locke's language and to make it seem universal? Or are we making Locke seem to follow Islamic thought? Why? Are we talking about the medieval Muslim in order to not talk about the contemporary Muslim? Or do we talk about the medieval to say something about the modern? What about the ethical predicaments in the text itself? Where do they go? What do we do with them? And what does our ability to see them today tell us about ourselves? Third, when we read these texts' afterlives, we can start to think about other ways of thinking about political order. Jum'a, that first person I mentioned, his geography turns to the east to imagine the Near East and the Far East as being connected. Tawtal's criticism of Ibn Tufayl demands equality and respect. Saliba and Ayyad want us to look at present-day corruption. And Farrukh wants us to always read knowledge through world historical power politics. These are each moments that invite us to approach these sources and their histories for critiques of the present and its ideals, for the reimaginings of its formations and its entanglements. So they invite us to read primary texts and texts about these texts and about the past, to imagine different worlds, to imagine different futures. And finally, we can read these political fantasies, interpretive grammars, and imaginations alongside the text itself. Are the distortions surrounding Hayy and surrounding valorizing him pushing out of view an ethic of passing by, of ceding space, of walking away? Is that an ethic that we want to embrace? Or today, is it one that we need to resist and set aside? And what about the islanders? As you guessed, I think we need to have much more sympathy for them than for Hayy, or at least I think we should recognize that we are more like them than we are like Hayy. Does the tragedy of their ethical principles subverting themselves help us to think about our own ethical principles, our own attempts to do what's right, and how so often bad results from good and good results from bad? If the islanders can't comprehend that, maybe we need to overcome Hayy, we need to overcome the islanders, and we need to overcome the text's reception history as well, so that we can imagine a different future. Thank you.
So, right, and so like, so it, and like, and the thing is, like, I kind of want to kind of come back to is that the presence of the soul by the absence of a soul. I'm not comparing this like dead dough to like a live dough and comparing the differences between them. He simply just intuits the absence of the soul as the causal reason for his brother's death and why his operation is not going to be successful. He then also learns that compassion is the wrong thing, and that what we need to do instead is contemplate. I put myself in the feelings of the Islanders, so I'm just like, this guy's freaking weird, man. And I'll try to be pleasant, but like this is weird. And so I'm kind of wondering, like as you're talking about like kind of the initial reception, he's lauded as kind of the hero, right? Like he's the philosopher who is enlightened up in their ivory tower, unable to correspond with the masses, but occasionally the right to reject like the sort of behavior of this psycho. And so I just kind of wonder, like, have other people kind of pick up on that, like that particular idea, like it's all like it's my understanding, right? Because it's very different. This all hinges on his mother's death, his inability to find a soul, right? And his decision that is the reason that he's dying, right? So that sends him on this life that ultimately leads to consequences. That must be a theme, right? It's like this is weird.
So I think it is. I think I might be in very lonely company, but now there's two of us. In the sense that the reception history of the text, both in European languages and also in Arabic, really does accept how Ibn Tufayl frames the story, which is to say, here is this character, and when the doe dies and he dissects her, he's a little scientist, rather than, why are you dissecting this creature that was your mother for all intents and purposes? So the short answer is people have not picked up on that weirdness, but that's what I want them to do, because I think it's actually in the weirdness that a lot of potentially generative questions can emerge about, for instance, if this is an allegory, if this is indeed a story, then read it like a story. Right? And if it's a story, that means that these little details about who does what to who and how and why are open to interpretation. And you can think about the person's, not just their motives, not just their intentions, but the things that they don't admit about themselves. Perhaps the self-deception that is built into what they are doing. So in fairness to Hayy, though, I kind of glossed over this part a little bit. When he dissects his mother, it really is like, it reads as though it's, so some commentators say, and he did it really like methodically in a cold and careful way. The first time I read it, I was like, the kid is freaking out, right? And understandably. And then when he's poking around her heart and he notices that the heart is empty, that the chamber is empty, he's like, there must have been something that's in there. And he actually goes and he explores other animals. And he discovers that what's that? Yeah. So he explores other animals as well. And he determines that, so when you look at the heart and it's empty, they're not alive anymore. But there are does on the island that are moving around that are fine. So he's like, the soul is still in their heart. And this actually corresponds to the science of the time, in which it was believed that there's a kind of steamy substance that would be in a steamy vapor that would be in the heart that would correspond to the soul. So in this sense, he's like, it's like a PBS version of science at the time or something, right? The one moment that I have seen where an interpreter of the text does think that there's something quite odd about the text as a whole is just that one reference from Ferdinand Tautal, who was a deacon, by the way, which is interesting, where he said, really, you think that the vast majority of people wouldn't be able to comprehend the nature of God? Why? Like, why not engage people in more generous or charitable ways? But that's really it. For everyone else, this is a text about the triumph of reason, the importance of empiricism, how you can discover the truth on your own, how philosophy and religion can sometimes come into harmony, but philosophy is just much better. And depending on readers' preferences, sometimes reading it as corresponding to whatever views they had. This was the Rorschach blot that I had mentioned before. Does that capture? Awesome. Yes.
Speaking of triumphs, it's hard for me to imagine how you perceive the text as a triumphal story, because I also by the end don't really. They go home and they get old and they die, and the rest of the world continues on as that.
That's a great question. What they achieve is they get to contemplate God on their own without all these pesky ordinary people who can't understand anything bothering them. And it sounds to me as though you're bothered by that, just like me. And that's exactly where the text does have this kind of openness, right? Where on the one hand, Ibn Tufayl is saying, and so it turns out the majority of people are, he actually uses some colorful language. He says, Hayy realized that the majority of people are stupid, weak-willed, and then there's two others, I can't remember. And so that's where he goes to the people and he says, you do you, I was wrong, and he leaves. And the two of them, Hayy is able to return to that ecstatic state where he's able to contemplate God. And Afzal is able to like come really, really close to it, or as best as he can. And then eventually they die, presumably happy. What do they accomplish for other people? Maybe is another way of framing that question. And that's an open question, because we could say they accomplish very little, except that they lie to these islanders who then continue on. And like, you know, sometimes I wonder, like, if I were one of the islanders and this, you know, weirdo who never met anyone until he was 50 and dissected his, I'm just really disturbed by it, but, you know, dissected his mother doe figure, but also discovered fire on his own. So, you know, kind of cool. If he were to come to me and tell me that everything that I'm doing is completely wrong, I don't think I would do what the islanders did and just like keep listening. I'd probably do what Hayy did and walk away, or maybe just tell him, like, I don't want to talk to you anymore, man. Like, you're really annoying. You're weird. You're incessantly preaching at me. And you're like, yeah, sure, you're my friend's friend, but his judgment was not so great anyway. Yeah, no, that's a great question as well. So the question is, how should we, tell me if this is right. So the question is, how should we understand the place of compassion in the text, where Hayy initially had been compassionate towards the plants and the animals, And then at a certain point, he basically says, nope, I was wrong. I should not be compassionate towards them. And then he meets Afzal and he's like, oh, I feel pity towards people. And then he goes to the island and he tells them, guys, your religion is kind of backward. Here's actually how you should do it. And then he's like, I'm leaving, but you guys do you, right? So how do we interpret that shift from compassion to contemplation, right? So this is where I think there are, as a reader of primary texts, I love inconsistencies in texts because I think that the inconsistencies are where a lot of the action is hiding. Right? So the story goes something like this. In his attempt to be a good person, really, in his attempt to contemplate God, Hayy also thought that he needs to be like the celestial bodies. And so he's, all into cleanliness, but he's all into trying to help animals and plants. But then he realizes that uses his body, that uses his corporeal existence. And he's like, this is stopping me from being able to contemplate God. So that's when he forgets, or he refuses to continue to help the animals or the plants. And I would think that if someone came to him and they learned the religion, the truth that he had correspond to Afzal's religion and all that, that he already got rid of compassion. So the fact that it returned, I read that as a kind of regression, because it's something that he was supposed to have already expunged. So his inability to see that the problem of compassion wasn't one that he had dealt with adequately, that's where I'm like, oh, there's something weird with him here. Maybe he's not that kind of flawless narrator. And it's interesting because there is, in addition to like a hatred of the ordinary or of the masses, there's also a hatred of the body in the text. Right? There's a kind of disdain for ordinary existence, for desire, for living with others, all in the name of some kind of contemplation. And I want to read that as Hayy's regression, but also replaying that conflict between the body and the soul, between the islanders as ethical beings who don't seem to have a problem with existing as embodied beings, right? So that's where I want to side with them again. Does that get at the question or not really? Yeah, no, absolutely. And in a sense, it's a question about the detachment, a certain feeling of superiority allows people to have. Maybe one of the echoes of that would actually be in the ease with which people all over the world can look at things happening elsewhere in the world and say, this is not my problem. This is happening over there. I'm just going to, Hayy decides to contemplate. We decide to, buy things, or we decide to watch Netflix or something of the sort. So maybe there's also an analog there about the ethical and political stances surrounding what kinds of things in the world we're willing to accept as problems for us versus the mindset that allows someone to say, not my problem, not my problem. It's over there, literally on another island now. Yes.
So I put two-part question. So first,
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that actually captures one of the points of contention in the history of medieval philosophy, both medieval philosophy in the Muslim context, but also in the Christian and Jewish contexts surrounding the role of scripture, reason, how far scripture can take you, how far reason can take you. Ibn Tufayl begins this text, by the way, by saying, and this is a whole very large can of worms. He doesn't say that, sorry, that was me. He begins the text by saying, this is a text that is going to disclose the secrets or the essence of Ibn Sina's Eastern philosophy. A lot of ink has been spilled on what that means. I do think that Ibn Tufayl does side with Ibn Sina on this question and with Ibn Rushd on this question of what reason can do, and that it can indeed take you as far, if not farther, than mere religious traditions. And in that sense, he is on the opposite end of that debate than al-Ghazali. But let me just say something about this can of worms since I opened it. Many people interpret this to mean that you need to read Ibn Tufayl esoterically, or he's not telling you what he actually thinks, and you need to be really, like, you need to read between the lines to kind of figure out where the truth is or something like that. I tend to think that, because there's no such thing as Ibn Sina's Eastern philosophy, that he's lying. Can I say that? I think he's making it up. There's no such thing as Ibn Sina's secret philosophy, and he probably knew that. The historian Dimitri Gutas has suggested that maybe this was a kind of branding campaign where he's like, I need people to read this text. What am I going to say? It has secrets that no one else has. Read me. No, thank you. That's. I think it really takes the text and gets one of the fundamental questions of how do we read it in relation to the, let's say, history of Enlightenment political thinking, and then to what do we do with it now, right? So here's what so on the one hand, absolutely, you can read this notion of the individual into the text. You can read this notion of the self-willed, self-made person into the text. And in that sense, it may be possible to draw a kind of dotted or dashed line from this to things like Locke and his notion of the individual, or Kant, or any of these other early modern or modern thinkers. I tend to really love the differences or the counterfactuals, or something like that. So and how that can be part of what shows us the oddness of the things that perhaps we take for granted about the Enlightenment notion of the individual, or Enlightenment understandings of toleration, or things of the sort. When Hayy goes to this other island, I sort of started to go in this direction, so I'll just go fully. I'll just commit to the bit. When Hayy goes to this other island, he really is nothing like Locke's individual, because there's two important parts of his body that he doesn't use, and those are his hands, right? One of the primary things with John Locke is that you're supposed to work. You're supposed to work on the earth, and in cultivating the earth, you get property. And once you have property, you can not only make things yours, you can now transfer it into money, and then you become super rich, and it's all okay, and that's justified. And maybe you can even take land away from other people because they're not using the land well, right? That's Locke. Chapter 5 on property. what an odd notion of the individual, and what an odd notion of what working the land allows someone to do. Instead, we have, and so that's Locke. We have other notions of the individual and the individual's obligations to political communities. We can think about someone like Vittoria, who was a theologian who wrote about the conquest of the Americas, where spoiler alert, the long and short of it is that missionary work cannot be impeded, and attempts to impede missionary work are in fact a legitimate reason to conquer the Americas, basically. That's how odd that Hayy goes to this island, preaches at the people incessantly, right? The text says he was there preaching at them night and day. And because of what they believe, where they're like, we have to like just listen to what people have to say, they're just, subjected to this guy just talking at them for so long, saying fairly ridiculous things, they thought. So it's that move of the desire to missionize suddenly being cast aside, right? Being put aside. That's what I find really fascinating about it. And he doesn't say, I'm just going to live here with these people, right? That would be an example of toleration, to say, I'm going to live here with these people. We believe different things, but that's okay. We'll make it work, even if I despise them and hate them and think that they're all going to go to a lake of fire or something like that, as you had said earlier. Instead, it's, I'm going to leave. I want nothing to do with these people. And in fact, they can keep doing what they're doing. And I'm going to tell them to keep doing what they're doing. You could read that as like a moment of pettiness, actually. Like a moment of like, you know what they're doing, I think, is going to lead them to that lake of fire. Yeah, keep doing it. Right? You could read it that way, I suppose. But it is a moment that's really quite open. And so there's a lot that you can do with it. In terms of what to do with it today, what to do with this question of disengagement, maybe. So on the one hand, I'm actually really skeptical about the regular demands that have been institutionalized across universities for what goes under the rubric of engagement. Usually it's like engagement and dialogue or something of the sort, where the demand for engagement and the demand for dialogue does a lot more work than actual engagement and actual dialogue. So I tend to be skeptical of those. At the same time, you can't engage with everybody. And in fact, living with people oftentimes means living with your enemies. And that oftentimes means living with people who would rather that you not exist. But that's part of what it means to live in a community. And in a strange way, Hayy's fantasy, Ibn Tufayl's fantasy of being able to go to an island far away where there's no one, no predators either, but where there's no one, just animals and plants and like your best friend, is a fantasy. One that I think increasingly people are entertaining, right? Where it's like, buying an island somewhere. Let's do it. Yeah. All right. We're best friends. But yeah, where there is this desire for imagining being on an island, and just as we have to take care of ourselves, right? Especially in times that are unsettled. It's also important to recognize what are fantasies, what work they're doing, and what certain moments demand of us, which oftentimes does not mean imagining what island we can go to, but rather figuring out how to make the big, big island that we are on one that everyone can be safe in. And maybe another way of putting it is, maybe the islanders were wrong to just have these 3 principles that they just followed without being like, you know, maybe we should like think about how we can make this a place where this weirdo and his Absal, the weirdo, and his really odd friend who you know, spontaneously generated an island, dissected his mother figure and all this stuff, and only met someone when he was 50. How we can make this a place where he can also live and be satisfied. They never seem to have presented that option. So maybe there's a lot of failure to go around in the story. Does that? Yes. Oh, is it time? Okay.
Yeah, this is a little quicker. It's more of a just a overshoot, right? Okay, so no. All right, so this is like a little like more of a historical question, like as far as this, but is this more of like how big of an influence do you think this would have had like on someone, you know, like if like how a lot of like the people like commentaries on it centuries later, you know, say like, oh, all this Western stuff is coming from here. Like how much do you think this would have actually had an influence on like, you know, sort of like Aquinas, like Western, like religious philosophy, where it's like, that was only like a couple hundred years later. Like, would there have been a lot of like that much exchange of ideas between like the Christian and Muslim world?
Oh, absolutely. Just not with this text, but absolutely. So Ibn Rushd, who Ibn Tufayl knew, you might know Ibn Rushd by the Latin name Averroes, right? So when you look at Aquinas's commentaries on Aristotle, he'll often say, the philosopher said, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it's whatever Aristotle said. And he'll say, the commentator said, blah, blah. And that's what Ibn Rushd said. And oftentimes you'll see that he's drawing on Ibn Rushd, or he's using him as a reference point to argue certain things. So in that sense, the claim that certain versions of Muslim philosophical texts were absolutely crucial both to medieval Christian philosophy and to the Renaissance is absolutely true. What I find interesting about it is, even if that is true, what cultural work is insisting on it doing for people writing a couple of hundred years later, right? But yeah, that exchange was absolutely fundamental to both the development of those texts and also for the preservation, really, of some of the primary ones. It's just important to not reduce it to mere preservation, which I think has also been a tendency. Yes, absolutely. So, and that's actually a super fascinating third question, right? So we've got on the one hand, well, fourth question. So we've got on the one hand, how do we read the text? How do we read its reception in Europe? How do we read the Arabic reception of that reception? And then there's, how do we read the suppression, right? The willful forgetting of how Muslim thought was always a part of medieval Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking. And there's multiple ways that I think we can read the political and cultural work that that did. On the one hand, one sort of clear way is that this coincided with the development of racial theories about going from Greece to Rome to modern Europe, with like there's a little gap, a big gap in that in terms of where texts went and things of the sort. This is why I was saying earlier that there's an important history to the really, I think, false and problematic claim, really, to the idea that all of these texts, when they went into Arabic, that it was like a transit stop, kind of like, you're at O'Hare for like an hour and a half before you go on to your next destination, and nothing kind of happens when you're there. So that notion of it being mere preservation is, I'd say, just as problematic as the notion that it didn't happen, because it becomes merely a repository rather than something that's active. And on the other hand, what a lot of the new work that excavates these links and these histories, a lot of what that work has, a lot of what it does, I think, is challenge a lot of conventional self-understandings and national and continental and civilizational identities that may have ramifications for how people think about what it means to be from Andalusia, what it means to be from Spain, what it means to be from France, what it means to be from Europe, if these are actually always already mixtures, if these are always already byproducts of a series of different processes. Think about how that might change how people who are really invested in a certain notion of the nation, how they might think about immigration, right? So I think that that's part of the contemporary stakes of why it's suppressed and why attempts to address it are oftentimes met with something like fear, hostility, or something like that.
Thank you so much, Professor Idris.
No, thank you all.